Today I'll be joined by Scott Pulsipher, the president of Western Governors University. Scott has some advice for policymakers who are thinking about next steps in higher education. And with a new administration and shakeups in congressional leadership on education and workforce committees, January 2025 will be a very important time for the future of higher education. Let's get right to our interview. What's your recommendation for an incoming administration?
Yeah, there's probably really two things on our mind always at WGU, and one is increasing accountability for outcomes. I think we have to believe that the most noble endeavor that we have in higher education is to help individuals change their lives for the better, and we have to hold ourselves accountable to that. I think that it can't be just that we exist and therefore we're valuable. I think we have to prove that, and I think that certainly from a policy standpoint and regulatory standpoint, we certainly can increase the reporting and the data and the standards that is education truly delivering value to the individuals? Because at the end of the day, that's what the government is underwriting, that all these individuals that are enrolling in post-secondary pathways, et cetera, we're doing that because we believe it is a pathway to prosperity and opportunity for them. And it can't be simply that we measure enrollment or we track, completion rates, et cetera. We have to know whether the opportunity and the value is actually being realized. And so I think accountability is a key provision. They're certainly sitting at a point where they should be able to collect all that data to know what was the economic lift that was actually delivered for all those students, what percentage of the students who start actually complete, and is it working for everyone so it doesn't just serve the privileged who already have all the access. It has to be working for everyone. And so I think those measures of accountability are really important. The other dimension that you can't have innovation without accountability. So I think this bias for innovation is another key dimension. I would say that any policy should actually incentivize and even award innovation that's advancing that value proposition that we talked about in the first instance. And we can't be codifying or buttressing up old models of higher education, because the old model of higher education, we've only got what we're going to get, which is it's propagating privilege. It's not actually expanding access for all those who've been underserved. It's not lowering the cost of education. It's not increasing the relevancy to the future work. And we are in desperate need of accelerated paces of innovation in multiple different dimensions of it: the quality and relevancy of curriculum, in the delivery and cost models, so that we can improve its affordability and lowering its cost to complete. We have to invest more and more in our equity endeavors. And so that requires innovation. That requires experimenting with new and different models of it. And yet the recent past has shown that there's been more of a bias towards saying, oh no, we only think this model works, and so we want to codify that in regs or in policy, et cetera. And that's not going to be good for anyone. You can't just make a mediocre product free and assume that somehow dramatically democratizes access. Maybe, Wes, let me say one other thing about this that we're particularly passionate about at WGU is we, even at WGU, don't believe WGU would have ever actually made it out of its startup period if we didn't hold ourselves accountable for key outcome measures like student progress and persistence and completion. The value and economic return for those who acquire the degrees we're providing, the costs that require them to complete that degree, the equity that we're advancing in terms of increasing access among underrepresented, underserved populations. We try to be as transparent as we can about all the impact and the value that we're delivering for students. Are we perfect in all those things? No. Do we have great outcomes, if you will, in every program? No, not yet. But if we don't hold ourselves accountable to it, and we aren't transparent to others who will hold us accountable to it, we won't then be obsessed about improving the outcomes so that we know we're ultimately delivering value for the students.
Tell us a little bit about what you did with factored graduate return.
Yeah, I think it started with us being really clear about some of the core value proposition that we had, and that was the quality and relevancy of the curriculum that we offered. It was the actual student experience, so we can increase the probability that every individual learned and completed. And third, that we made it low cost and highly affordable. And one of the ways in which we want to measure that relevancy and the low cost is that we looked at what was the economic mobility that the graduates were experiencing as a result of having completed their program at WGU. So the first thing you have to look at is the return.
Okay.
What was the economic situation of those individuals? Flatly speaking, is like, what was their income level 2 years after they graduated? We try to keep a pretty narrow attribution window, by the way, because like a lot can happen in the 2 years after that,
Right.
and certainly a decade later, that you shouldn't attribute all of that economic progress just because they got a degree. But we just look at 2 years after graduation relative to what their income was when they started. And we then look at that gain. And then we just simply take that gain and say, well, how many years do they have left until retirement age of 65? And we don't add any inflation adjustments for the ongoing, wage growth or anything else. We just say, let's just take that flat economic value and divide it by their total cost to complete. And what is the factor of return that then we provide for each graduate? That's the factor graduate return. And our most recent data, we've now been doing this. We're into our 4th year of doing it. So we have 3 years of data now reporting on it. Our graduates, on average, the median is 26 times their cost to complete a degree with WGU. And we have certain programs that are more than 50x. At the lower end, we have some in teaching and education where it may be 12 or 15x. But even that's like, it's a really good return. We even have some postgraduate endorsements or master's degrees in education that have a 25 or 40x return, because if it only costs you $4,000 or $8,000 complete, but you get a $4,000 a year increase and you still have 25 years left to complete, you're like, that's huge. Like that's just $100,000 on a $4,000 to $8,000 plan. Is like, that's a really, really good return. And so we're seeing that having focus on a way to measure, if you will, quality and relevancy of the programs is whether or not the economic mobility is being realized. Is it relevant to the world of work? Are the graduates getting the jobs? Are they getting the economic advancement? And the other key factor is focusing on the low cost. And that's where we've benefited from no seat time, meaning competency-based allows you to go as fast as you are able. We also have a fixed rate tuition for a 6-month period. So
that'll
if
keep
you
costs down.
can complete your degree in 2.5 years instead of 4, you're going to spend a lot less money, and you're going to get that same economic return. And you'll even have couple more years of that return than you would if you took 4 or 5 years to complete it. And so it's not a perfect measure. This is another simple lesson I learned from my Amazon days, is that even an imperfect metric consistently tracked, the trend is meaningful.
Yeah.
So you can understand whether or not you're improving the value for the graduates or not, even if it's an imperfect measure. We're encouraged that others like Third Way and others have developed some of these other same economic mobility. The work that ACE is doing with advancing from the Carnegie classifications around social mobility are also key. It's just starting to evidence more of this value proposition, because this has certainly been one of the biggest triggers in current times around higher ed, which is people questioning the value of it. And we're sitting here saying it's still the single greatest catalyst for people to change their lives for the better, but we certainly can improve the affordability and lowering the cost of it. We certainly can increase the relevancy of it so that ultimately the economic mobility is worth the investment. And we should always be endeavoring to make sure that promise holds true. If we're going to fail, it's mostly because institutions are not being held accountable for developing programs that are relevant to the future of work, or they're charging exorbitant prices to complete it.
So you
know all this stuff too, but even with the sticker prices exist out there, and we know there's discounts off it, and there's all that dynamic of parents or students being really great that they got a scholarship that reduced their actual net price even 40K below what the sticker price is, but you're still paying 40K a year. And you're just like,
come on,
wait a second, and if the average cost to complete a bachelor's in the US today is $100,000, you're like, that's really hard to get a great job to make $100,000 investment worth it. Not to mention all the lost wages for the 4+ years you're going to be going to school.
This is why I love the factor graduate return number, is because cost is a part of that factor, right? Yeah. Like you can't just charge $200,000 for your bachelor's degree, and then yeah, I mean, a post bachelor degree, you do have income gains, but when it's offset by how much you invested in it, I think it incentivizes the right perspective on the cost, the initial
Yeah.
cost.
Yeah.
The other thing that I'd like to explore with you. So, I mean, you've implemented this this factor graduate return tracking on your own. It's not like the department told you, "Hey, Scott, we need to understand the value of WGU better,
Right.
and we're going to hold you accountable to this." You've just said, "Hey, team, if we're going to improve, this is what it looks like. We're going to measure this, and we're going to figure this out." And there are a lot of it's a struggle to figure out what income gains look like because there's no great metric for that. But there are, federal legislation right now. The College Transparency Act, the
Mm-hmm.
College Cost Reduction Act has some things in it too that that are attempting to emphasize and to track student outcome data. What do you think about those efforts? Where are we moving in the right direction?
Uh, I would say certainly very much so that we are moving in the right direction. I suppose that we shouldn't be surprised that those that are most opposing it actually are institutions of higher education. And there may be some legitimate reasons why, meaning one of those legitimate reasons could be that there's no uniform, student profile that exists across
Right.
all these 4,000 institutions that are regionally accredited. And without a uniform student profile, it's really hard to actually compare, if you will, the value proposition of different institutions or even programs at different institutions when the student profile is a big factor to actually
Yeah.
determine some of those
And it's
outcomes.
radically different. I mean, R1 is going to have a radically different student profile
Yeah.
than an access oriented institution.
Yeah, I like to joke is like, wouldn't it be great if all of us could just admit individuals who are going to be successful anyway? And then you
Exactly.
do have to start to wonder is like, well, did we actually do anything to help them be successful? And so we know that the distance traveled from someone who comes from a disadvantaged background into an elite, highly selective institution is like their distance traveled is incredible. The value proposition is amazing. But that's such a small percentage of those that they actually admit versus those, the very large percentage that are already advancing in their lives. And so what net value add is there really there? And so anyway, I get the reasonable argument that relates to there's such a diverse, population of individuals out there being served across the sector that it makes it somewhat difficult to do this. However, I think the primary pushback is because if we actually have institutions increase their accountability for improving these outcomes, even if the starting points where we are all different, that's not what we're trying to do in terms of comparing institution to institution. We're just trying to see whether institutions are increasing
Right.
the success of the students that they're serving. It may be that you're starting at only 20% completion rate and because of a variety of different factors. But what should be expected is that you're continually improving the
Right.
outcome for those individuals. You're increasing it to 25%, then 30%, and on.
You're trending in the right direction.
Yeah, this is part of this, I think, is captured within the College Cost Reduction Act that has been advanced by the Republicans on the House side, as well as what the social mobility, including that into the Carnegie classification that ACE has undertaken, which is actually trying to see, reward institutions, if you will, who are advancing equity in access and attainment and return, because you don't want to have institutions fall into the trap of, again, like I mentioned, is like just admitting those students who would be successful anyway. So that's how we survive as an institution. You're like, oh no, you also want to incentivize the ability to make the access true for everyone. How can you democratize access? And even with technology and AI, I think we can also democratize learning in the way that internet democratized access, because now you make it much easier to adapt to every individual. And in doing that, you're increasing the probability that every student could succeed. And so I think it comes back to it's not only factor graduate return, because if you only have 15% completing and those have a great return, we're like, well, what about the other 85%?
Right.
So you have to also start simply with, of those who start, how many complete?
Right.
And that has to be true for regardless of the duration of the program, whether it's a 4-year bachelor's program or whether it's a 1-year micro credential. Like, if you start, you should have a high probability of completing. And for those who complete, do you have a great return on that? And is that worth the cost? But equity is a key part that we emphasize at WGU too, because that promise, if the promise of education that if you attain it, you're going to attain opportunity, that has to work for everyone. We can't keep living with these highly disparate outcomes that exist across different demographic backgrounds, whether it's race, ethnicity, or low income. We actually really, in fact, want education pathways to be working for those who are particularly disadvantaged. Otherwise, it just propagates privilege.
Yeah, exactly.
We'd love to see intergenerational prosperity exist for everyone, not just for those who already have it.
Right.
But that's the trap. I think it was Malcolm Gladwell who called it out one time. There's 60% of those admitted to highly selective institutions come from the top 1% of household earnings.
He's been pretty direct with the most elite institutions. Yeah. I think he's been a voice out there.
Some of the institutions don't shy away from it, and maybe that's fine. But then you start to realize those institutions may not be really serving the overall societal endeavor that we have. And the societal endeavor, I think, that started with the Moral Act back in 1862, and it was true with the GI Bill, and it was true with the original Higher Ed Act in 1965, was we actually want to dramatically expand access to these post-secondary pathways because we think they're relevant to the future work and developing the workforce that will power our economy and everything else. We want that to be accessible for everyone. We want it to be traversable and completable for everyone, and we want it to be worth it. And that has certainly diminished over the last 50 years. There's in the House hearing that I was in, and I've shared this data before, but I can't remember exactly, Wes, but basically, if you looked at 50 years, if you came from the top quartile of households in terms of household income, your completion rates went from 40 to 70% plus.
Right.
In the same 50 years, if you came from the bottom income quartile of households, it went from 6% to 13%. You're like, man.
Huge failure.
Shouldn't we actually be working on designing and advancing a system that makes opportunity work for everyone?
Yeah, that's crazy trending in the wrong. I mean, we should have a system at this point where our gains for those who need it the most it's the focus, and the data pushes us there. And that's what's incentivized.
In fact, what you might, there's certainly a perspective, and I could be persuaded to align behind this perspective, which is that the design of the higher ed system itself originally was to democratize opportunity, if you will, to truly advance the American dream for everyone. But in broad terms, you could look at and say it actually did the opposite. It stratified it such that privilege begat privilege, and privilege just getting higher and higher. And all those who actually needed opportunity working for them really got left out. And you now have a stratification of society in a way that higher ed contributed to it. And if you started poking at and trying to understand why, there's certainly certain elements you can point to see why the incentives were not aligned with rewarding outcomes for students, et cetera. They were rewarded for things like research and
this is one of the reasons,
and athletics, and then you end up with U.S. News World Rankings. You end up with all these things that are rewarding or incentivizing who you exclude rather than who you include.
Well, this is I think that this is a great message to put out to either incoming administration that bold innovation is necessary, and we'll measure that by impact. Yeah, fair enough. Okay. Well, thanks, Scott, for joining, and we appreciate your time as always, and we'll look forward to having you back in the near future.
That's great to chat with you. Thanks for the time, Wes.